Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll wait a few minutes for a few more people to join. Hopefully everyone can hear the audio all right. If there's any issues with the audio or the visuals, you can please make a note of that in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat today. So welcome everyone who keeps coming in. We'll get started in just a moment. Hey, welcome everyone. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on policies and procedures under the Uniform Guidance. I'm so glad that everyone could join us today to hear about this important presentation about recent updates to the Uniform Guidance that may affect your local policies and procedures and what you can do. I'm Amy Miller, the Federal Grants Administrator for the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR. And here today to present is Karen Norris from Kanoko Consulting. We are recording today's webinar, and the video and the slide presentation will both be available on the OPR website for you to review or share with your colleagues. Throughout the presentation, please enter any questions you might have in the Questions tab, and we will have time set aside at the end for Q&A. You can also use the chat box if there's any questions coming up about the technicals, any audio or visual issues, we can answer those in the chat. Now, before we get started with Karen's presentation, I'd like to let you know about some of the federal grant resources available on the OPR website. Karen, if you could switch to the next slide. You can find all.
Trying. Sorry, Amy.
No problem.
Here we go.
Great. So here you can see a screenshot at the OPR's website. If you select under CEQA and State Clearinghouse, there's a link for federal assistance. Next. And if you go here, you will find all of our different resources about finding, applying for, managing federal grants. The State Clearinghouse at OPR is California's single point of contact for the intergovernmental review of federal programs. And here you can see highlighted the Applying for Federal Grants link will take you to this page where you'll go to submit your notice of a federal grant application to comply with the Executive Order 12372 on intergovernmental review. And so here is the form where you will submit your notice along with the SF 424 federal grant cover sheet. You can see all of the applications that have been submitted under the Submissions tab. And you can also receive notifications of federal grants applications submitted in your area under the Registration tab. And now here again, you can see there's a link for federal grant resources that will take you to the Library of Information, learning about applying for and managing federal grants. There's also links to the grants pages of every federal agency. And the federal grant resources link is where we will be posting the slides and recordings from today's presentation. And then here you can see selected the federal grants e-list, which hopefully most of you already receive, but if not, you can sign up for it here. This weekly email provides updates on federal grant opportunities, news, trainings, and events. I'd also like to highlight our next webinar will be in September 22nd on grant amendments, also hosted by Karen Norris. And now with that, I'd like to turn things over to our presenter. Karen Norris is a nationally recognized expert in the grants community based in the DC area. She regularly presents at state and national conferences and has provided expert testimony about federal grants to the Maryland General Assembly and the United States Senate Subcommittee on Federal Financial Management. We're very pleased to have her here with us today. So thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Amy. Really appreciate the introduction. It's so nice to be here today, again, presenting for the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. So today we're going to talk about policies and procedures, which have had some changes under the revised uniform guidance. So we're going to look at what provisions in the uniform guidance require written policies and procedures. And we'll start there. And then we'll move on to, well, maybe there's some other areas that you might want to consider that may need some updates. Maybe there have been some changes in your own organization, or you've implemented something new. And then the third bullet has to do with increasing skills about writing policies and procedures. And along with this webinar, I have provided a handout that if you look under the handout tab for the webinar today, you'll see a PDF of a template for writing a policy and a template for writing a procedure, along with a filled in example that you can use. And if you want to, you can download that and save it someplace convenient, like on your on your desktop, so you can get to it after the webinar is over. Or you can actually print it out and use it to follow along when we're going through the slides about those templates. And then lastly, we'll talk about, well, what are some local processes for updating policies and procedures? Where do you start, and what do you look at first, or what should you look at next? So let's continue. So a few words. The uniform guidance requires non-federal entities to have written policies and procedures. It just does. It's a requirement. And it's also part of what they call a system of internal control. That's the basic operating environment for each organization. Who has authority to review, who has authority to sign off on things, what are the step-by-step procedures so employees know what to do, who has who does the monitoring, how does communication take place. So all that is part of a system of internal control, and written policies and procedures are very much part of that. So written policies and procedures give non-federal entities a viable defense in case of a governmental investigation or an audit. You've got an audit finding. So what you want to do is you want to provide reasonable assurance, to an auditor that you're making a good faith effort to comply with requirements. And having written policies and procedures demonstrates that good faith effort. So they provide you with some flexibility. The uniform tells you what must have a written procedure, but they don't tell you how. And so you're able to define how you're going to do things in your organization through your own written policies and procedures. So that's what they do. They allow the organization to define the how, documented in writing, which is important. Written policies and procedures are also one of the best ways to improve an organization's internal controls, which is what we just talked about, minimizing the likelihood of waste, fraud, and abuse. And it's also important for auditors when they come on site to provide an audit. So while many non-federal entities already have written policies and procedures in place, there are likely updates that need to be addressed for the uniform guidance, particularly since it's recently been revised, and there are some changes. So let's talk about the key provisions in the uniform guidance that require written policies and procedures. We'll start with that. So existing grant policies and procedures need review, and some of them will require updates. Some of them might be okay, they can remain as written. Some of them are old and they need to be retired or canceled, and some will be new to be created because of something new under the uniform guidance. So you want to identify the policies and procedures that are required by the uniform guidance, and that's a good place to start, and that's how we're starting this webinar. But we also want to review other existing local policies and procedures that might need some updates or changes as well. And then there may be some new policies and procedures that you might want to put into place. For example, if you're using the 10% de minimis rate for indirect costs. If you don't have a written policy that indicates you're going to be using that de minimis rate, you might consider creating a written policy and procedure. We're going to charge indirect costs to our federal awards, federally connected awards, federal via state awards, and we're going to use the 10% de minimis rate. And then you have that written documentation about what you're doing. So these are the particular provisions that are named in the uniform guidance: internal controls, travel, financial management, personnel, which would include your time and effort reporting. Procurement is a big one, and report certification. And we're going to look at each one of these now in a little bit more detail. In the uniform guidance, the provision 200-303 describes the importance of internal controls, and it names two models of internal control: the COSO model, which is a nonprofit financial services company, very well respected, called the Council of Sponsoring Organizations, or COSO. And then you have the Government Accountability Office. That's the big federal auditor. You know, the GAO has a publication it's produced called the Green Book. And the COSO model and the Green Book really are the same model. There are 5 components of internal control and 17 principles. The difference between the two is that the COSO model was written by a nonprofit association, a financial services nonprofit, a non-federal entity. So the language is going to be a little bit more tailored to the non-federal audience, where the GAO Green Book is a federal agency, a federal website. The language is going to be a little bit more targeted toward federal agencies. But other than that subtle difference, they both pretty much describe the same model of internal control. And if you're not familiar with internal control, if you're on the program side of things as opposed to the financial side, you can have a discussion with your internal auditors or financial folks so they can explain to you a little bit more, well, what is this system of internal control? You know, and just know that having written policies and procedures is one of the principles. It's a good part of a system of internal control. So you're contributing to the strength of your organization when you have written policies and procedures. So there's a big focus in the uniform guidance on the importance of internal control, which is why I mention it. And that's the provision number if you want to look at that or share it with your financial folks. Internal control affects all policies and all procedures. It demonstrates how you provide good stewardship of federal funds. It indicates who are the responsible people who are going to review and approve, sign off on things. Are you following your internal protocols? It includes risk assessments and monitoring, among other things. So let's talk about travel. The provision for travel is 200.474. I always like to give my attendees the provision number so you can look up the source document, the source language, rather than just relying on my summary of the official provision. So travel costs may be charged as actual costs per diem, or a combination of the two. The important thing is that whatever you do, it needs to be consistent for the entire trip, and there needs to be receipts and supporting documents along with your written policy and procedure. So you may want to look at your own organization. How are we handling travel costs? Do we tell people to give us the actual travel costs? Do we have any constraints where you can't spend any more than this much money for mileage rate, no more than this much money for your subsistence, your meals, how many meals a day? Or are you doing a generic per diem rate? And then that should be committed to a written policy and procedure. Now, sometimes this one is a little bit difficult because sometimes they're competing priorities. And for example, the mileage rate, that's typical. You know, the local mileage rate may be different than the federal mileage rate. So if you're charging mileage to a federally connected grant, which one do you use? Do you use the local rate, or do you use the federal rate, or which one takes precedence? So again, is the local rate higher than the federal rate? Is the local rate lower than the federal rate? And the rule of thumb is to the best practice the most restrictive rate will apply. So if the federal travel mileage reimbursement is 58 cents a mile and the local mileage reimbursement is 45 cents a mile, you would charge the lower rate because it's more restrictive. And your written policy and procedure should include how you handle that when there's a difference under the federal grants. Also, something that's fairly new in travel are family-friendly policies, what they consider family-friendly policies, and that would include overnight dependent care. So your regular child care costs are not eligible to be charged to grants. I mean, that's just the cost of of driving to work every day, and your maintenance on your car, and you have to buy insurance, and if you have small children and you have daycare, you need to pay for that. However, if there is overnight, if there's something unusual, like the employee is being sent to a professional development conference, and that conference is out of the area, which will require an overnight stay, then you can charge the cost of the extended child care to the federal grant. And you would want to have a written policy and procedures that indicate how you're handling that. And once again, must be consistent with local written travel policies and procedures. The next provision is financial management, and there's 200-302. The local financial management system must be able to identify awards by the assistance listing number, which was the old CFDA number. The FAIN is the federal award information number, your award number. What's the award number? What's the year? Now, if you're a subrecipient and you're receiving a subaward through your pass-through entity, then you would probably need to identify the original federal award to the pass-through entity plus the pass-through award number, subaward number to the subrecipient. And you would need the name of the awarding agency and the name of the pass-through agency as well, if that's appropriate, and any upcoming data standards or requirements. By the way, we will accept questions. You just put them in the chat box if we're going as we go along. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the slide presentation. So we'll get to all of your questions. So also for financial management, written policies must also cover the allowability of costs and the cost principles. What cost is allowable? What cost is unallowable? Now, there's actually 3 sets of cost principles that are associated with the uniform guidance. Everyone knows that the uniform guidance has cost principles, and they are found under subpart E of the uniform guidance. That's Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. So we have the uniform guidance cost principles under subpart E. Then there is an exception for hospitals. Hospitals follow the uniform guidance, but they don't follow the uniform guidance cost principles. They follow the HHS cost principles, Health and Human Services, which are located at Title 45 of the CFR Part 75. And then there are the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation cost principles. So if there's a procurement contract under a grant, and there usually is, what is the recipient going to do? Our subrecipient, when they receive an award, they're going to spend the money. They're going to hire people and they're going to buy things. They're going to buy supplies. They're going to buy computer equipment, maybe fire trucks, depending on the type of grant it is. So it is possible when there is a procurement contract underneath or within a grant, you could use the Federal Acquisition Regulation cost principles rather than the Uniform Guidance cost principles. That's not a must, that's a may. You may use the FAR cost principles instead of the Uniform Guidance. So the FAR is at Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 31.2, and you would want your financial management policy to indicate that there are 3 different sets of cost principles, and you're basically just going to use the uniform guidance unless you're working with a hospital. You may or may not want to include the FAR cost principles as well. Many for-profits are more who deliver goods and services that you order under grants are more familiar with the FAR rather than the uniform guidance. So your contractors, your vendors may prefer the FAR, but that means for the grantee, it means another set of cost principles that you have to keep track of. So that would be a good discussion to have with your grant teams after the webinar to decide, well, what do we want to do? And how should we write it up? Personnel and time and effort reporting is a biggie because there are a lot of audit findings related to timesheets and timekeeping, and is this individual working 100% on a grant, or is this an individual working 50% on the grant and 50% not on the grant? So there are issues with time and effort reporting. So you would want, under this type of written policy and procedure, the uniform guidance would like non-federal entities to indicate how they hire. How do they hire staff for grants? Do you conform that should be conformed? Should you conform to your HR policies and equal opportunity, equal employment opportunity requirements? Or do you just want to appoint someone to the grant? So that would be, you would need to I guess define that would be the better term. A lot of non-federal entities will name people in the proposals who they want to serve as the project director once the grant is awarded. And when the grant is awarded, they just want to put that person in the slot. Well, does that conform to your HR policy? Or do you have to, under equal opportunity, do you have to advertise that position anyway? So these are things that you would want to discuss in your organization, and then to have in your written policy and procedure how you're going to handle that. That's the first issue with time and effort reporting. Another one is this proportional issue, like, does the person work 100% on the grant, or is the time shared among different grants or between grant and non-grant activities? So it's important to document 100% of time for each individual on a grant, whether it's 100% on the grant or 50% on the grant and 50% someplace else. You need to document 100% of their time, no matter how they ration out the time they work on different activities. You also have to indicate how you're going to handle cost sharing or matching requirements. You know, is the individual who's working on the grant, are they charging their salary to the grant, or are they donating their time to the grant? So you would want to indicate that. And then the uniform guidance gives you the option to keep track of time and effort reporting as hours or percentages. And I can tell you that many non-federal entities prefer percentages because it's so much easier. This person works 20% of the time on this grant. This person works 50% of the time. This person works 100% of their time on the grant. So non-federal entities tend to prefer percentages. Auditors like the hours. Auditors would much rather see, okay, this person works, 40 hours a week on this grant, or this person works 20 hours a week on the grant. They prefer the hours. Whichever way you do it, it should be documented in a policy and procedure. Procurement is a big one as well, and there have been revisions to the procurement processes in the revised uniform guidance. So your existing written policies and procedures should be reviewed, and they should be updated with the changes. There are changes to the thresholds, the micro purchase threshold, and the simplified acquisition threshold. There are changes because now they are included a preference for Buy American, and so there are different updates in the revised procurement provisions in the uniform guidance that you would want to capture in your written policies and procedures. So we mentioned the new Buy American procedure. We have this free and open competition. So can you put someone on retainer, and how long would you keep them on retainer before you'd have to recompete the contract? All that is okay, but you would need to spell it out. And then, as we said, the methods of procurement are new. The revised uniform guidance has split procurement into two basic categories. There's informal methods of procurement where you don't need a bid process. You can just have price quotes, or the micro purchase, you can just go out and buy. You don't even need price quotes. So they're informal methods of procurement, and then they're the formal methods of procurement, which require a competitive bid or a sealed bid. So you would want to make sure that your procurement policy and procedures updated to include that type of language. Report certification is not greatly revised, but it's important to mention that when there is a report, a financial report, a progress report, and those reports, a procurement report, who's signing? Who is in authority, who's able to sign the reports and certify that the reports are accurate. So it needs to be an authorized organizational representative, which may or may not be the project director, depending on your organization. And then the certification, the language includes personal responsibility, not just institutional responsibility. So the officer, the authorized representative, organizational official who's signing these reports is certifying that the report is true and accurate to the best of their knowledge in their role as vice president or CFO or CEO of the organization, but it also includes some language that makes them personally responsible. And in the provision at 200.415, they actually have a phrase that they want to see printed on each form. So you would want to make sure that you check that particular provision, that you see what the requirements are, what type of liability does the person have, both personal and professional, when they sign the report, for the accuracy of that report. You may want to have your auditors and general counsel look at that, and you may want to have a written policy and procedure about it for review and signature, so that once the signing official signs the report, they know that that report has gone through enough people's eyes and hands who've reviewed it, so we know that it's accurate before they sign off on it, because there are such stringent requirements regarding professional and personal responsibility on report certification. So that's what the uniform guidance requires. And at minimum, you would want to make sure that, and when you're looking at your local policies and procedures, what do I already have and what am I going to need to get? You would want to make sure that you have a local policy and procedure for each of those uniform guidance requirements. Now, what are some other areas? What else maybe would be a good idea to have written policies and procedures? So risk assessments is a really good one because it's mentioned so much in the uniform guidance. It's part of a system of internal control, whether you receive federally connected funds or not. It's just a part of internal control, and it's just an important way to conduct business. Audit is always governed by risk assessments. The higher the risk, the greater the likelihood there's going to be problems. There's going to be waste, fraud, and abuse, or just um, improper payments. Oh, I didn't know I was supposed to keep my receipt in order to be reimbursed. I didn't know I was supposed to ask for prior written approval before I made an amendment or before I purchased that equipment. I didn't know, but it's still a mistake. So the higher the risk, the greater the likelihood there are going to be problems, some findings, and you want to work toward lowering the likelihood of having audit findings and having funds disallowed, because that's always a hardship to have to pay back a disallowance. So what should the policy include? Well, you might want to say we have a risk assessment checklist or matrix that we use. And if you do, great. And if you don't, that might be something your organization might want to think about. Should we have a risk assessment checklist or matrix that everybody should be following to help us? What are some of the indicators of risk? Are we doing monitoring pre and post award? Are we correcting our deficiencies once we get an audit finding? What do we do? Do we address them? Do we correct whatever the finding was? And how quickly do we do that? We want to make sure we get all the corrections done before the next audit takes place, because now the auditors are going to note, oh, you had this finding last year and it's still open, you haven't fixed it. That's going to be a ding against you on the new audit. So you want to look at, well, what do we do when we find out we have an audit finding? How do we go about correcting them, and how quickly do we want to get them corrected? You want to have expectations of your partners or any contractors that you're hiring as part of the grant, that they have to demonstrate good stewardship of funds, and you have the right to check them out. And then determinations from an awarding from an awarding agency perspective. If you're for the federal awarding agency or for the state pass-through awarding agencies, once they look at pre-award risk during the pre-award process, where applicants have submitted their proposals and the awarding agencies, pass through or federal, are deciding whether or not to make an award to a particular applicant, they're going to make a determination. Are they going to deny the award, or are they going to make the award based on risk? They're not only scoring the proposal and looking at the merit review of the proposal, but they're looking at the risk review of the applicant as well. And if an awarding agency denies a proposal based on poor risk, they're going to have to enter that non-federal entity into the FAPIS database. And FAPIS is the Federal Awardee Performance Integrity Information System. I had an attendee once who said, oh, that's the naughty database. And really, you do not want to be in that database. That is a database of non-federal entities who have gotten into trouble with their federal awards. They've either had an award terminated, or they had poor financial management, or they had an award denied based on, oh, they're too risky. For whatever reason, they've gotten into trouble. They've been entered into that FAPIS database. You don't want to be in that database. So first of all, there's several provisions in the Uniform Guidance. 200-205 is the pre-award risk assessment, and 207, which is now, actually 205 is now 206, because with the revision, and 207 is now 208, 212 is still the same, Appendix 12 is still the same. Those are different kinds of issues having to do with risk. 208, 207, 208, depending upon which version of the Uniform Guidance you're looking at, is going to be about specific conditions. Ooh, this non-federal entity is a high-risk non-federal entity, so we're going to make this recipient report monthly rather than quarterly. So that would be specific conditions. And 212 or 213 is the determination. Are we going to deny the application based on risk? So risk is really important, so important. It's mentioned in so many places in the Uniform Guidance. If you don't have a written local policy or procedure that addresses risk, something like, well, we self-monitor, and if we see a problem, we are very quick to correct it. We follow good financial procedures. We have good sign-offs. The right people are reviewing reports and signing off. If you don't have a policy that has to do with risk, it would be a consideration to have one, and then that would give an auditor reasonable assurance that you're aware of the issue of risk. So that's a good one. Payment is an important one, and it has to do with the Cash Management and Improvement Act. So if you're the awarding agency, like the pass-through entity, you would want to have a policy that would include, when we receive requests for reimbursement, we minimize the time between receiving that fund request and actually making the disbursement. We're going to have strict requirements for advance payments. If one of our subrecipients wants an advance payment, they can't be high risk. They have to have clean audits. They have to have corrected all the deficiencies or all the findings from the prior audit. So you might want to have some definitions in there when you would consider allowing an advance payment, and then what is accountability? What do you ask for as written documentation for the payment requests? Financial and program reporting are very important important because as recipients or subrecipients, we're asked to report all the time on the progress being made, both financially and programmatically in the grant. So we're looking for any upcoming changes to your financial and progress report formats. Now there is a transition from the DUNS number to a new unique entity identifier number. And for those of you who have not heard of that, every non-federal entity is going to be incrementally assigned a new number to replace the DUNS number. And that process is going to occur when you renew your registrations in SAM.gov. Once all non-federal entities have received their new UEI number, the new UEI number will go live in April of 2022. We're still using the DUNS number, but be aware that there's an upcoming change. Well, that DUNS number is on every single report. The DUNS number is required to apply in grants.gov. It's probably required in other internal reports. So that's a really big change to keep track of. And again, the big date for the changeover is anticipated to be next year in April 2022, which will be here before we know it. So you might want to update your financial and program reporting and your report formats. You also want to look for any upcoming standard data elements for grant reporting. So the GREAT Act was passed in December of 2019, and it's currently in pilot stage for the first 3 years. So in 2022, there is a group, an identified committee that's looking at grant reports, and they're going to identify some standard data elements. So we're wondering if there's going to be a new grant report format as a result of this. The GREAT Act, the GR in the GREAT Act stands for grant reporting. So that would be something to look for and to monitor, and just one piece of the puzzle for a revised policy. Closeout has some new requirements in the uniform guidance, and Closeout begins now at the end of the period of performance, at the end date of the grant. It no longer waits for the receipt of final reports. So awarding agencies are able to close now with the information that they have available rather than with the final report. And if they're able to close, if they have to close with the information available, they're required to report the recipient or the subrecipient to that FAPIS database. It's very aggressive language, as a material failure to comply with the award terms and conditions. And again, no one wants to be entered into FAPIS. So Closeout might be worth some time, if you haven't already done so, to review that revised provision in the uniform guidance and then look at it within the context of, ooh, do we need to have something written in our written local policies and procedures that give everyone a heads up how Closeout should be handled? Because we don't want to be entered into FAPIS. We've got to get our reports submitted on time, because if they're late, the awarding agencies don't have to wait for them anymore. So that's a big change, and that might be something that you'd want to have a policy on. Prior approvals is one that people always forget. There's a list of 20 sometimes in the uniform guidance under provision 200-407. It's just a simple list, and it's a list whenever prior approval is necessary. So you may want to look at that and provide technical assistance, or just to have communication within your own organization. Golly, we need to get prior approval before we can buy equipment, even if it's in the budget. Even if it's in the approved budget, prior approval is still necessary for equipment purchases, your fire trucks, your cars, your computer equipment. Prior approval is necessary. Prior approval is necessary for a budget amendment. So should you have a written local policy and procedure for staff to follow that lists, don't forget about this prior approval, because if you forget it, you can have an audit finding and a disallowance of funds, which we want to avoid. So we want to list when the prior approval is necessary, and the procedure could include technical assistance to raise awareness. How do you inform people within your own organization about the necessary practice of prior approval on certain things? And what do you do if prior approval was skipped? Can you ask for a retroactive approval? And you can, in some cases, if you skip it, and you catch that, you realize that you've skipped it. Let's say equipment, that's a big one that people forget about. Even if equipment is in your approved budget, you still have to ask prior approval before purchasing. And if you just went ahead and purchased the equipment and then realized, oh, we forgot to ask prior approval and we already bought it, you can ask for retroactive approval. And oftentimes it can be given. And then if you have that written documentation on the books, it saves you from an audit finding and a disallowance of funds. So prior approval would be important to think about and decide whether that would merit, is it important enough to merit a written local policy and procedure? Indirect costs has a lot of audit findings. It's a complicated topic. There are the provisions in the uniform guidance. And of course, you might want to talk about, well, do I have a negotiated rate or are we using the de minimis rate? And if I'm the pass-through entity, what are my responsibilities now for negotiating the indirect cost rate with my subrecipients or allowing them to use the de minimis rate? So this would be a good provision, a good topic to consider having a written local policy and procedure. Cooperative audit resolution at 200-513 in the uniform guidance is an alternative to address audit disputes. You know, an auditor will have a finding, the finding will have a disallowance of funds. The recipient or subrecipient, whoever is the auditee, is not going to be happy with that finding, is not going to want to pay back the disallowance of funds, and will appeal or dispute it. So a policy could include, well, what's the timeline for completing audit findings? You know, don't disallow our funds until we complete this timeline, until we have an opportunity to address the audit finding. And then the cooperative audit resolution would be a signed agreement between the awarding agency and the auditee, the recipient or the subrecipient. Look, we got an audit finding, we'll fix it, give us time to fix it. And the agreement is usually a compromise where the awarding agency has the authority, has the right to reduce the disallowance. Listen, it's important to us that you fix this finding, not argue about the amount of the disallowance. So we're going to go ahead and compromise, and we're going to reduce the disallowance if you promise that you're going to fix the finding, because that's what's most important. And we don't want to see that finding recur in future years. We want you to fix your policies and procedures. So if you don't know about cooperative audit resolution, it might be a good thing to learn about. It might be good to have a written policy and procedure, because you can ask to have a disallowance reduced. You know, instead of just knocking heads and disputing the finding itself. Well, okay, we'll fix the finding, but it's the amount of money that we have to pay back is what's killing us. How about some relief? So there are a couple really good publications from the Association of Governmental Accountants, and there's the link to the website about this COROI, that's the Cooperative Audit Resolution, and I forgot what the O and the I stand for, but there are a couple of guides on their website, and that might be something to look at and consider having a written local policy and procedure so you have the right to ask for it. Disallowances are never any fun. Okay, so now let's get to the main event. How do we write a policy and how do we write a procedure? So a policy, let's first understand the difference between what a policy and what a procedure is, because they are different and two different sets of people write them. So a policy is pretty much going to be written by your top leadership of your organization. It's broadly stated guidance. It's a guiding principle. It's developed by leadership. The board of directors would be involved in setting the policy, or certainly the board will approve a policy. All policies are approved by the board. They're approved by the top leadership of the organization, and it's usually meant for very long-term goals. So that's a policy. So let's give an example of a policy, and I've picked a very simple topic, payments and drawdowns. So we want to know whether requests are made within the required timeframes. Does the organization hold funds for an extended period of time? Or no, we will reimburse the funds within 15 days of the request, or within 30 days of the request. Or no, you've got an audit finding that you need to fix. You have a report that's way past due. We're just going to hold the reimbursement, the funds on your reimbursement request until you submit that missing report. So if you do things like that, that has to be documented about why and how and for how long. Is the organization in compliance with the Cash Management Improvement Act? You want to make sure that whatever you do, you remain in compliance with federal and state regulations. And is the organization in compliance with the uniform guidance? So that's the provision on payments and drawdowns. So here is a template. Now it's hard to see the whole template on the slides because each slide has a piece of the template. So that's why I created that Word document that we put into a PDF and for you to refer to. So you can see what the full template looks like on one page, or what the policy looks like. And you're welcome to continue using the format that's already in place within your own organizations, or if you happen to like the templates that I provided you, I just kind of compiled best practices from many agencies that I've worked with. So you're welcome to use the policy template that I am providing you today. So the first thing for a written policy is you want to say, well, this is the purpose of the policy. Define why you need a policy. Why are we writing it? So here is the example that had to do with the advance payments. We're going to provide better management and use of funds and to comply with federal requirements. And that justification for having a written policy can be used for any number of financially related policies. Go ahead and use it if it's helpful. So number 2 is the policy itself. The policy is a broad statement or description of the policy. For example, the organization will minimize the time frame between an advance payment or drawdown request and meeting the payment obligations. The organization will make drawdowns within the time frames that eliminate excessive holding times of federal funds, unless you're holding them on purpose because there's a specific condition, because you're dealing with a high-risk grantee, and then you need to define that. And what's the authority? Well, you're going to include the organization's authority and include the federal citation. For example, any kind of an organizational statement about sound financial management will do. At ABC Foundation, we work towards sound financial management as part of our system of internal control. Or we're also complying with the Uniform Guidance Provision 200-305 if you're writing about advanced payments. So you want to have the authority that you're basing the policy on. And then lastly, you're going to have an authorized signature and an effective date. It's very important to have the date signed next to the signature because that lets you know how old the policy is. In years following, you may want to look back and say, that's an old policy. The uniform guidance, that policy was written before the uniform guidance was revised. Now the uniform guidance is revised, so we better update the policy. Procedures, on the other hand, are step-by-step instructions. Policies are very broadly written. They're prepared by the leadership. Procedures are going to be prepared by your management team. And they're going to be start and end points. They're desk instructions. They're work instructions. This is how you do your advance payment. This is how you handle a travel policy, a travel request of funds. And of course, the procedure is going to require approvals. Who's going to sign off on the request by the employees? So using our same example for advance payments, the step-by-step instructions could include a whole bunch of stuff. And you can see I'm relying on like the who, what, where, when, why, and how much. Those are typically, what is answered with a written procedure. Who's initiating the advance payment? Well, the recipient or the subrecipient is going to ask to be reimbursed, and who is authorized to ask for the reimbursement request or the advance payment, and who is authorized to approve it. Who performs the procedure? What is needed to support the request? What type of justification? I'm a low-risk grantee. I'm not on a high-risk list. We provide good stewardship of funds. We can handle advance payments. We'll use the money appropriately. When would a request be appropriate? Well, you don't need advance payment for that. Just submit a cost reimbursement like everybody else. When would a request be inappropriate? When is analysis needed regarding cash? When should the request be made? Within how much time after the request is received? And then when is a response expected? So these are all kinds of questions that can be thought of when writing the policy, the procedure. Let's look at another topic for travel. So this procedure might include, well, what do you need in order to pay for travel? Do you need to see reservations? Do you need to see airline tickets? Do you need to see conference registrations? What is required in order to pay travel? And then when will the reimbursement be made? Will it be made in advance before the travel is made, or do you want to see proof of the travel before the payment is made? I worked for a non-federal and an institution of higher ed, and And people were always going off to these professional development conferences, and sometimes people would take advantage, particularly if the conference was in a nice location like Hawaii, right? So they would use the grant funds to pay for their airline ticket and to pay for a conference which they never attended, and they would go off and have a little vacation on the nickel of the grant. And so this one institution of higher ed that I work with actually wanted to see the registration papers. They wanted you to, I had to submit my name tag. At least I went up to the registration table inside. I had to submit the name tag. I had to submit the plastic holder, any little badges. I had to submit a copy of the conference book and list what different sessions I attended. I mean, they were not going to pay my travel reimbursement just because I had a plane reservation and a hotel, and a reservation. They wanted to make sure that I actually attended the conference. So what supporting documents are needed, how and when and how a request submitted, who authorizes the travel request, and what happens, again, if the local rates differ from the federal rates, how are you going to handle that difference? And it's usually the most restrictive requirement would apply. And so now let's get to the template. The procedure template is going to be longer than the policy template. It's more detailed by the very nature because it's step-by-step instructions. So we start off the same way with the purpose. Why is the procedure being written? And here's an example using our advance payment example. The purpose of this procedure is to describe the steps needed to complete an advance payment or drawdown request. And then it's always going to refer to the policy. It supports the advance payment policy, and you can have maybe your organization numbers your policy number 101-2 and the date, and it aligns with federal regulations. You may also want to say, because we're working within a state, it aligns with federal and state regulations. Then again, like the policy template, you want to right away say, and this is the authority. So you want to include the organization's policy number. That's the authority. We have a travel policy. We have an advance payment policy. And or you're going to insert a federal or state citation. So here's the example. Refer to the advance payment policy number and date based on the Uniform Guidance 200-305 or based on the annotated code of the state of California, whatever that provision number is. But you would want to base your policies and your procedures on some statute, on some authoritative source. What is the authority that allows you to make these demands? And now the policy, the procedures should include, well, who's involved? What staff is involved? And who's responsible for signing off? Whether it's the project director, the director of accounting, the subrecipient project director, the federal program officer, the pass-through entity program officer, whoever is involved, it should be defined in that written procedure. A lot of procedures will include definitions. Whatever term is included in the procedure. So for advance payment, this is the definition of advance payment. This is the definition of a cost reimbursement. This is what a drawdown request looks like. This is a letter of credit. Whatever vocabulary is specific. Then you get to the procedure. What are the step-by-step instructions for staff? The project director will notify the director of accounting that a subrecipient requests an advance payment. The director of accounting will verify that the subrecipient is eligible for advance payment, that we will conduct a risk assessment so we know they're a low risk grantee, and will obtain prior approval from the federal agency. Then after the federal approval, da 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 da. And so that will, you want to provide these step-by-step instructions. What about reports? Are reports required? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. When are they due? Or do they have to include certain data elements like the award number, the subaward number, the name of the federal agency, the name of the project? So that would be, sorry guys for the hesitation. A report may or may not be applicable. So if it is, you would say so. Or, a report is not applicable for this procedure, or a quarter report is required to correlate the expenditure of funds and performance outcomes associated with the advance payment. Then you have supersession or replacement or cancellation. Is this policy a replacement procedure for something that was before, or is it brand new? This advance payment procedure updates and replaces the prior procedure and have the name, the number, dated to incorporate the changes that resulted from the uniform guidance effective December 26, 2014, and now updated with the new date. The revised uniform guidance was effective November 12th, 2020. So you could either use that, or you could use the date that you're actually updating the policy and the procedure. Who's maintaining this procedure? Who's responsible? What organizational unit within the non-federal entity? Who are the responsible people who develop the procedure, who are going to be responsible for making sure it always remains current? And then with the effective date and how would it be communicated to the organization. We'll send out an e-blast, a blast email to all the project managers. We'll post it on our intranet. We have it in a policy book, whatever you do. And then of course, you want a signature of an authorized individual and an approving official on the new procedures template, with the date, or if it was retired. And then lastly, the distribution list. Who's going to get it internally? Does anybody get it externally? For example, you may have some subrecipients who need to get a copy of it. You may have partners who need to know what that particular policy is. So the language is very important in both the policy and the procedure. And I'm hoping that these two templates that are provided give you some ideas on how to update your own written local policies and procedures. So what process should you follow? There are different strategies. What should I update? Well, you can look at the last date. You can look at the last time the procedure was updated. And whoa, this procedure hasn't been updated for 10 years. Maybe we ought to look at it, or this procedure has a lot of impact because we've just gotten this big grant. So we better update this procedure. Or we have a pending award. If we get it, we're going to need new procedures for that particular award. Some organizations look at their audit findings. Usually when there's an audit finding, there's a finding about a particular problem, but it also means that something fell through the cracks. How did that audit finding happen? Did someone not sign off on something that they should have signed off on? So some organizations will look at their audit findings and use that to help inform their decision making, whether maybe we need to make a clearer policy and procedure about this so we don't get a repeat audit finding in the future. Sometimes there are changes in staff. Has your chief financial officer retired? Do you have a new chief financial officer that you need to refer to in all the procedures? Or anything that's new, like the uniform guidance has some new citation numbers, so you want to remove the old ones. Some people will look, maybe they need this done by a specific date. Sometimes there are new legal responsibilities. Sometimes the funding agency has a requirement. And of course, for this particular presentation, there's been a change in federal regulations. The uniform guidance has been revised, and that's going to necessitate changes in your local policies and procedures because some of the provisions have changed. There may be changes in state or local regulations that you need to incorporate in your local policies and procedures, or you might have some changes internally. So what are some steps to consider? You're going to identify the need for the policy and procedure. You're going to determine if it's a new policy procedure, an update, or cancellation. You're going to determine whether it's just this really has to be a major rewrite, or maybe it's just a minor change, like changing the name of a new CFO who's signing off on things. Some non-federal entities will use a schedule for updates or revisions. We want to make sure that we review at least a third of our written policies and procedures every year, for example. You would draft the policy or the procedure, you'd review it, it would go for review. When you submit it to your supervisory folks, it would be approved and signed, and then you would distribute it. It's no good having a revised policy and procedure. It could be the best written policy and procedures imagined. If nobody knows about it, it's not going to be effective. So distribution is important. So these other considerations would be, you need to communicate. You need to let people know when you have a new or updated policy or procedure. You need to be able to train your staff so they know what to do. And then what are your instructions for filing? Are you filing it in a hard copy, in a handbook? Are you filing it digitally on your website? Who has access to that? What are some website postings that would be important? So in summary, it's really important to have written policies and procedures. It's required to demonstrate your stewardship of federal funds. They're a part of a system of internal control. They help you address audit findings, and they help you maintain your currency. They help you keep up to date with regulations, particularly if the regulations have gone through some kind of a revision. So with that brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope it was informative. Amy, do we have any questions in Q&A?
Great, thank you, Karen. I do not see any that have come up so far. So please, if anything pops up you'd like to have a question about, or you'd like to hear a little bit more information on, please enter that in the questions tab. Well, I have a question, Karen.
Yeah.
When would you say that you would use a policy versus a procedure for that template?
Yeah, well, you need both. They go together, and the policy is going to provide the overall guiding principle. And the policy, again, they're written by different sets of people within an organization. The policy is going to come from your leadership, from your board, and it provides, and it basically sets the tone for the organization. But these policies are going to be written very broadly. Now, the staff who are actually working to deliver the program, they need more help. They need some step-by-step instructions. Okay, how do I order something? What is our procurement policy? How do I arrange for travel? what are the procedures that I'm supposed to follow? So your procedures, Amy, will be written by your managers. It will be written by staff who are actually working within, your managerial staff for your employees so they know what to do. I hope does that clarify a little bit? One is more procedural in nature than the other.
Right. And so you would need to have both going together. Mhm.
Yeah, you would need to have both. And whatever procedure is written, the procedure should refer to the policy that was created first.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions coming up, so maybe we'll move forward. And if anything
Okay.
does come up, um, everyone here is welcome to contact us. So I think we have a few more slides,
Yeah, a
including
couple
our
more
contact
slides
info.
while you're still thinking. That was a good question, by the way, Amy. Thanks for that. So I just want to remind everyone, here's my friendly disclaimer, that this presentation is intended to provide general information and does not constitute legal or financial advice. Please consult with your legal and financial advisors back in your organizations. I hope, however, I really do sincerely hope that the information that we gave you in this webinar helps provide some insights as you further pursue your work in the grant community. Or you could take the topic and the provision number and share it with your legal or your financial advisors and say, well, what do you think about this? Do we need more policies? Do we need a written policy for procurement? Do we need a written policy for indirect costs? What do you think? So we hope that it's been helpful in that way. And again, here's some contact information. The state of California has done just a wonderful job in providing you with a website that's full of resources and links to important information. And to get to that website too, for the Office of Planning and Research, there's the website. And again, there is Amy's contact information. She's the federal grant administrator for the state. And if you have a question for her, there's her direct email right there. Thank you, Amy, for providing that. And
Thank
then
you.
here's my contact information. If you start to share some of the information that we discussed today with your grant teams, and then, oh, what did Karen say about this? I can't quite remember. Or I'm not sure I have this right. You can email me, and there's my contact information. If I receive any emails, and I do, not frequently, but every now and then I do, I always copy Amy so she's aware. And then I'll be happy to answer if I possibly can. Again, I can't give you financial or legal advice, but I can help provide some additional explanatory information if necessary. So with that, that brings us to the end of our slides. Amy, is there, oops,
Okay.
let's go back. I just wanted to double check. So a black
Yeah.
screen is a big clue, right? So Amy,
Great.
is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, I think we'll just close out by thanking everyone for listening today, and hopefully you learned something new. You can pass along to your colleagues as well. Again, we have recorded today's webinar, and it will be posted on the OPR YouTube page. So you can hopefully find that through the OPR's homepage as well. And all of the slides should be posted now, actually, on our federal grants resources page under events and trainings. And again, I'd also invite you all to join our e-list weekly email newsletter. And that is where you will find the registration for our next webinar, which will not be until September. So we'll see you after the summer, September 22nd. And that one is going to be also hosted by Karen and will be about grant amendments. So another important topic. Hope to see you all then as well. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening.